Welcome to the webinar today called The Tree of Value Using Data to Break Down HR Silos. I'm really excited to talk with you all today. My name is Cole Napper. I'll do a longer introduction in just a second, but we're here to talk about how people analytics, talent intelligence, workforce planning, and behavioral science are coming together to create the Tree of Value. But before we get started, I wanted to talk about a few housekeeping items. If you've got questions today, please put them into the chat function on the right-hand side. We will have a Q&A section at the end where we'll get to those. Also, I'd like to start out with, if possible, an audience poll. And so you can find this poll in the right chat window as well. But the first question that we've got for the audience today, which I'm actually very curious to see what the results are, is what field of or what branch of the tree are you coming from? So are you coming from people analytics, talent intelligence, workforce planning, or behavioral science? And we'll get to those in just a second in terms of viewing those results. But while we're doing that, I'd love to do some quick introductions of our esteemed panelists today. So first of all, we have Toby Colshaw here. So Toby is the Vice President of Talent Intelligence Strategy at Lightcast. He's had some really stellar roles in the past at both Amazon and Royal Philips. And he is the leader of the Talent Intelligence Collective podcast. But I have not done your introduction justice, Toby. So if you give us a quick introduction and tell us what your background is.
Thank you very much. I don't sell yourself short. I thought it was a lovely introduction. You're doing a very good job. So I fell into the world of talent intelligence much like I fell into my previous work roles of recruitment and sourcing and research. So I very much come from that search, sourcing, recruitment side of the house. And honestly, I wanted just to make my sourcing team make more placements. And I ended up spiraling down this world of talent intelligence. And then for the last decade or so, I've been pretty heavy into what I'd call pure talent intelligence, but we can get into what that is and what that means. But I come from all of this very much from that hands-on practitioner perspective of being on the front line of talent acquisition, recruitment, and sourcing, and then through into talent intelligence more recently.
Absolutely. Well, if it's not clear from Toby's introduction, he is representing the talent intelligence branch of the tree, and you actually have a wonderful book called Talent Intelligence. That is, I don't know, I guess you would say the standard of what it means to do talent intelligence. So thank you so much for joining us today, Toby.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Our next person we have is the illustrious Alexis Fink. So thank you so much for joining us, Alexis. She is the former VP of People Analytics at Meta, the current past president of SIOP, which is confusing to say. She spent 30 years in people analytics and has done a variety of things. But Alexis, I want to give you a chance to fill in the gaps of my introduction there.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. I really appreciate that. Cole is right. I've been doing this for 30-ish years. A lady never shares her age. But I've had the opportunity to run teams that did this kind of work explicitly at Microsoft, Intel, and Meta. And actually before that, I was doing large-scale organizational transformation work, which draws heavily on all of these principles for BASF, which at the time was the world's largest chemical company, as well as spending my dissertation supporting NASA and the Navy, trying to keep fighter pilots alive by applying these principles. So the opportunities to work with this stuff are vast and has been enough to keep me fascinated for a third of a century.
Well, and if we could put it up on the screen, Alexis is also world renowned for her work on the just wonderful book, Investing in People, along with Wayne Cascio and John Boudreau. And this is a really great resource for sharing about how to quantify the impact of people and people initiatives in the workplace. And so please, if you get a chance, check that out as well. Next, though, we also have Adam Gibson. Adam is the global leader of workforce planning and creator of the Agile Workforce Planning methodology at Ernst & Young. He's had a variety of roles at other places, as well as a British Army military veteran. And I don't know, Adam, give us a little bit more about workforce planning and your background.
Yeah, sure. And really great to be here. my background in it came from, my latter jobs in the army, because eventually someone puts you behind a desk, led to having to do some workforce planning. And I didn't have a clue what it was. And I was in an operational theatre, so didn't really have the ability to be able to Google it or research, and fumbled my way through it. Everyone survived, as no harm was done. But that sort of gave me something that I then carry forward, and have done in a number of places. I've done that internally in organisations, setting up new, transforming existing workforce planning functions. And then for about the last 5 years, I've been doing that as a consultant, which is great. I get to do what I love doing across different industries, different organisation sizes, short term, long term, and I'm able to leverage bringing in so much more of the data and information that we want, which really speaks to the branches that we'll talk about today. It's great to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then Adam, as I mentioned earlier, he has written the Agile Workforce Planning book. And so, again, this is kind of the gold standard of how to do workforce planning in a VUCA world. And so I think it's now more relevant than ever. But Adam is obviously representing the workforce planning branch of the tree. Alexis, I forgot to mention this earlier, is representing the behavioral science branch of the tree. And then let's go to me, I guess. So I'm Cole Napper. I'm the VP of Research, Innovation, and Talent Insights at Lightcast. Prior to this, I was a people analytics leader at FedEx, Texas Instruments, Motive, Orgnostic, Toyota, Grainger, a whole list of companies. And I am representing the people analytics branch of the tree. I have a background in IO psychology. Along with Alexis's help, I'm actually co-chairing the SIOP Leading Edge Consortium conference on people analytics this October, if you guys want to check that out. I'm also the co-host of the Directionally Correct podcast and the newsletter under the same moniker. And if you'd like to pop it on the screen, I also am the author of People Analytics Using Data-Driven HR and Generative AI as a Business Asset, which is coming out in August. Really excited about this. It's going to be a very provocative book. I hope everybody gets a chance to look at this. But as a part of the webinar today, if you wouldn't mind throwing it up, we our publishers, we all actually have the same publisher now. SHRM, it was recently merged into Kogan Page. They're providing a discount if anybody is interested in buying any of these books, and I think our helpers here will put this into the chat as well. And if you're interested in buying Investing in People, it's also going to have a 25% discount at the SHRM store. But these are really, really excellent resources and to help understand the tree of value. All right. Well, I think we should have the poll results available, and they will pop up on our screen if a magical person will put this up here. So let's see who we have in the room. We've got 36% people analytics. I love that my branch of the tree is doing well. 22% talent intelligence, 25% workforce planning, and 15% behavioral science. So we've got a really good spread here of people that are involved. But as we know, we're going into this, why don't we pop up the tree of value for the group today? I think many of you, I imagine if you're attending, probably came across the blog article that I published on this. And some of you may even have seen me present this last week at the Talreos conference as well. But the concept here is that if we're thinking about the functions in HR that have historically proven the ability to bring about the most reliable and consistent value to the HR function, it's really the entire tree of talent intelligence, workforce planning, people analytics, and behavioral science. They represent different branches of the tree. They have different origin stories, and we'll talk about that today. But the goal here is that we see that HR trends, they kind of come and go, but these four disciplines are what I would consider to be the tried and true parts of the tree of value for organizations. But one of the things we wanted to dig into today in today's webinar is also, what are the roots of the tree and how are they interconnecting these functions, especially in the moment that we're in, that I call the value of human capital labor data? And is there a chance for us to be less siloed or on less so on different branches of the tree and to come together as one, as a function? And so with this, and now that we have, I guess, any comments from the rest of the panel here on this tree, the concept, and I'll pose this to the audience as well. If you'd like to put it in the chat, what branches are missing from the tree, and what are most important to your role as well? But any thoughts from you all about the tree before we dig into each of the branches themselves?
I'll just jump in and say how much I appreciate seeing these come together. In my people analytics teams, I've tried to do all of those, sometimes with explicit responsibility for them. So I've seen firsthand the power of bringing these together to support organizations, organization strategy, organization decision making, and also to support employees and even prospective employees. So, Cole, these are often treated quite separately, but your work in bringing them together, I think, is tremendously valuable and helping all the different pieces sort of see the strength in traveling together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'd also add I think I appreciate, and it's probably the first time I've really seen it as, these are all equal partners. I think there's been enough, probably not as a tree, but I could imagine for nefarious purposes, someone trying to claim, well, the trunk belongs to one of the practices and everything else will branch off it. I think we've seen enough of those. So sort of having this as, look, all our roots are in we all go back to the same place. We're all sort of, our genesis has been different, but fundamentally there's a lot of things that we do that's quite similar. I appreciate it, and you're bringing a great conversation forward, Cole. Love it.
Absolutely. Toby, anything you'd add?
I was wondering whether we were doing creeping death and it was going to come to me. I'm not gonna lie. I got distracted, as I often do, with the chat and all the questions coming in, which I think are really interesting because I think it sets the scene for a lot of the stuff we're going to discuss later. But I really love the visual. I think there's some real value in the specialization of each branch. But I'm a very literal human, so I like the fact you can even take it much deeper. So even if you think about the branch itself, one of the problems with talent acquisition analytics or talent intelligence specifically, you can get way too focused. And I did presentations 10 years ago around looking at kind of individual cells and the chloroplast and the chlorophyll, rather than stepping back to see like the health of the overall branch or leaf or etc. And I think that plays really, really beautifully into this, because if you are stuck in that minutiae and that real focus, you kind of just forget about the entire context and the fact we are all interconnected. So I think it's a really great visual.
Well, why don't we dig into that further, Toby? This is an excellent point. Each of the branches of the tree have a different origin story, a different background, and perhaps even a different definition. Could maybe start us out with talent intelligence? And if my little helpers will put the talent intelligence one on the screen as well. Can you talk about these branches? Can you talk about what talent intelligence is to you and what comes to it and why it's relevant right now?
Yeah, so TI for me is essentially using external labor market data primarily, and then coupling that with some kind of internal data as a benchmark to really try and help drive business decisions. So what that external labor market data can be is pretty broad. I think the name in of itself will tie you towards the talent lifecycle, and people think of it tied to talent acquisition. I think where it gets particularly messy is historically you had a very different definition between practitioners and vendors. So you saw practitioners usually coming from exec research or talent acquisition and sourcing that will be looking at it from a kind of a labor market intelligence perspective. And you had a lot of the vendor practitioners or vendors using it more to mean talent management analytics. So I think definitionally it's a little bit messy still, but I think operationally and practically, it's very much using that external lens to say what's going on contextually and how can that affect us from a talent perspective.
Absolutely. Well, recently you've been talking a lot about kind of the VUCA world that I mentioned earlier, and this concept of BANI as well. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. How do you see the role of talent intelligence evolving because of these concepts? And can you maybe define them as well?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. And apologies, you can probably hear my chickens in the background, but there's not much I can do about them. They're also quite banny as well. So as you say, but banny is that evolution from the VUCA world of volatility and uncertainty, complexity, ambiguous, into this much more brittle and extreme version we're seeing now, where you've got a labour market that's reacting very aggressively. You've got some real fragility within there. We saw collapsing supply chains through the whole COVID period and Panama crisis, etc. Like there's just a fragility around it. For me, where talent intelligence really comes in heavily here is it helps set that context and helps set the scene. And I think it's bringing the timeline of intelligence much closer. So it's having a much more agile, much more flexible and fluid intelligence function rather than something that's a little bit more safe, a little bit more structured, a little more stable, that is much longer term thinking. It's just becoming that much more aggressive and much shorter term.
Well, if you think about this in terms of the intersections amongst talent intelligence, people analytics, workforce planning, behavioral science, do you see that there being kind of a collaborative component to get ahead of this Vanny, this VUCA, this chaos that's coming? And two, just to be self-critical here, are there any branches on the tree that you think are missing for talent intelligence?
So I think it's impossible not to have these elements more interconnected. And if you aren't bringing them together, you're going to have silos that fall over. And actually, I think the orchestra piece on the intro is a really nice metaphor for this as well. Like if you've only got the strings playing, it's going to sound really funky. If you've only got the woodwind, I'm not a musician, I have no idea. Whatever the other elements are, like if you've only got half these things playing, it sounds out of sync. It sounds wrong. And I think that's probably where most of us have felt through our careers. We see our silo, we do our piece, but it feels kind of out of sync and it feels not complete. I think as we're starting to progress and evolve as functions, and we're seeing that interconnectedness, we are seeing that come together much tighter. So for me, like talent intelligence was giving the strategic lens to a lot of SWP. It was that external context that was coming in. But equally, it's completely irrelevant doing TI if you're not really leveraging your people analytics team and saying, okay, well, what's going on internally to help me set the context for this? So I think it's got to get much, much more connected. I think the beauty of TI is the number of sub branches, sticks, whatever, is almost limitless. Like you can go in so many different directions. I've seen teams that are just hardcore recruitment, marketing, analytics specialists, and they're deep, deep into that. I've seen teams that are hardcore into M&A intelligence, and they're deep, deep into that. So I think there's lots of sub themes because essentially you're looking at the whole external context. But I think for me, it's a great place to start the conversation from.
Yeah, we can get all the way down to the chlorophyll. I love it, but this is excellent. Well, I want to bring in Adam. Let's talk about workforce planning. So, what is workforce planning by your definition, and how did you come to become a subject matter expert in that space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and look, I'm sure this is the case for many things, but I mean, for workforce planning, ask a million practitioners, they'll give you a million definitions. So let's go with how I see it. It's a data-led approach to creating the right workforce that's going to deliver the desired business outcomes. And when I'm talking about data-led, this is both qualitative and quantitative, which is probably the bit that there isn't sufficient focus on. As I said, I got into doing this through being kind of thrown into doing it in the latter stages of being in the army. And then when I came to leave the army, because just over a decade ago, there was little appetite outside of the military. There weren't many jobs for people who had a particular skill set within the infantry. So the only thing I could really leverage was what I'd done within the people space and the little bits that I developed around workforce planning. I then started doing more short-term tactical workforce planning when I was at PwC, and then went across to the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, to be their head of strategic workforce planning. And it's through doing both of those, I saw two interesting lenses. One, at PwC, recognizing that you couldn't do successful short term without also having a view to the long term, even though many people thought you could. And then when I was at the Met and you're looking towards the long term, you can't just come up with a glorious plan out for the long term if you're not sighted on the short term. And I suppose it got me to a position of having to test and experiment, self-teach in a number of different areas and try things and go, that works, that doesn't work. And it was through that I created a method that worked for me, of workforce planning that kind of connected these different horizons together. And it was through sharing it with other people that people said, "Oh, actually, you're onto something. Let's, wanting to try that out in other areas." And that's where it sort of came together as agile workforce planning. So, that's kind of the approach that I've been advocating for a long time, of taking this more joined up approach, almost the branches and sub branches within workforce planning of, almost trying to do the same as you're doing now with the tree, of going, look, a lot of these things are connected. Let's stop treating them as discrete activities and wondering why execution becomes difficult.
Yeah. Well, maybe Adam, just for the sake of the audience, could you help us understand how agile workforce planning is maybe a little different than traditional? And what role does internal versus external data play in workforce planning, thinking about things like supply and demand?
Yeah, no, great question. Um, so what makes it agile? So I suppose the first of it is, rather than it being set on, static on a particular horizon, it is looking at multiple time horizons at the same time. The thing, I mean, there are a number of elements that make it agile, but let me sort of go for the simple bit first. Strategic workforce planning has traditionally been done as a linear process. You start doing the analysis, you come up with some sort of plan, you do your little ta-da moment, and then everyone disappears back into the ether. If you're lucky, it might get executed, but inevitably it doesn't. Workforce planning done well is a cyclical business process. And if it's cyclical, it allows you to do certain things different. So rather than there being an upfront massive discovery exercise of to the data point, let's collect every bit of data that exists in the known universe and try and glue this in. And it take a year for you to get to the point of having your ta-da moment at the end, and no one cares, and everything's moved on and things have changed. Whereas doing things in a more agile basis allows you to take whatever data you can get your hands on, as dirty and ridiculous and scant as it is, go with that. Just assume that is go with that. What does that start to tell us? Does it look right? Doesn't it? Doesn't it? If we were to execute on that basis, what risks are there about it? Okay, well, let's just, what things are there, what are the things that we go, there's some no regrets decisions here. Okay, let's do those, let's iterate. And being able to do and coming up with a way of doing workforce planning that is more about iterative changes to the plan and incremental problem solving, rather than trying to throw every problem statement that the organization has into the same hopper. Those are the key things that make it a more agile way of doing workforce planning. And crucially, it means that you just get to value quicker. And that's what's so important for the business and for business stakeholders. It's easy for people to lose faith for something that's going to take a year to do, whereas being able to do something that quickly moves the dial and means that it can keep track strategically and more operationally and tactically, that's crucial.
Absolutely. Well, thinking about the pulling together of people analytics, talent intelligence, and behavioral science with workforce planning, how would that better influence operational strategy for firms, but also how they think about things from like an FP&A or financial planning and analysis perspective?
Yeah, it was a great question. Look, I mentioned earlier around the qualitative and quantitative, and that's probably one of the key dimensions to have front of mind when you start to think about the data that comes from a number of these different areas. So, Toby made the point earlier of the connection between the skills and talent intelligence and how that feeds into workforce planning. You'd recognize that for a lot of organizations, the main workforce lever they're going to pull is buy. Okay, so if we're assuming that that's the case, then those two things need to be intertwined, and workforce planning needs to be taking the intelligence that it has from what it can get from talent intelligence to inform the buy decisions. Maybe it only gets it to a certain point before there's a bit of a handover of, okay, here are the broad numbers and skill sets, but in terms of tactical execution, it's over to you. But then from a different perspective, when you're looking inside the organization at more of a build lever, which is probably the next in the list. Well, a lot of that is going to be around behavioral science of not just how do I throw a whole load of training courses at people and wonder why change doesn't happen, but how do we actually make a difference? How do we actually make that tangible impact towards the things that we're trying to achieve across all the different levers?
I want to come back to that behavioral science point here in a second. But Adam, are there any branches of the tree that are missing?
So I think there's something to be said about org design, and you might sort of say that that's an offshoot. That's part of the workforce planning part of it, or you might say that it's own. But I also wonder about where economics sits as a practice, particularly when you're thinking about organizational economics, and back to that the FP&A conversation about, okay, where does that connect in terms of how the organization's running, and indeed, depending on the organization, how you might value that organization. So that's another one that sort of comes to mind.
Yeah, I love that concept of unit economics. Like if you add one more human being to the equation, do you get one more level of input increase, or does it start to diminish? So that's fascinating. But I want to bring on Alexis now, and I've unfairly pigeonholed you, Alexis, into talking about behavioral science because I know you could talk about all four of these branches. But can you talk a little bit about what is behavioral science and how did you become a subject matter expert in this space?
Oh gosh. So behavioral science is the broad set of how humans engage in the world, right? So this obviously includes things like psychology, social psychology. There's a guy on one of my teams who is a developmental psychologist, super important as we think about learning and career kinds of things. But it also includes economics, which Adam just talked about, and the methodologies that come with that, as well as some of the decision making and the theories and approaches. And it includes things like anthropology. I had a graduate anthropologist on one of my teams who was just brilliant at helping make sure that we were doing really thoughtful qualitative research and approaching problems of culture and change in ways that were really quite sophisticated. I've even had folks coming out of not quite a behavioral science, but pretty darn close, or perhaps others would consider it to be included, things like marketing. Where you would include some of the change management kinds of attributes. So I think there is a very, very broad group of behavioral science subdisciplines that can be relevant to questions of people and behavior at work. In terms of how I became an expert, oh gosh, you're assuming that I am. I want to put in a plug for a liberal arts education. I had a liberal arts undergrad that sort of forced me to be exposed to all kinds of things. I explicitly think about history, frankly, also as a subject matter expertise area here, although I don't know a ton of historians specifically in this space. There are also obvious things from a doctorate in industrial organizational psychology where I studied specifically. And then I'm just sort of a super nerd, and this is what I do recreationally. So all of those come together. Before I hop off of this, though, I want to build a little bit on both Adam and Toby. In terms of talent intelligence, one of my absolute favorite uses, which I know you use, but you didn't mention here, was competitive intelligence for the business. So knowing what other companies are doing can also be really valuable. Seeing emergent skills and constellations of skills, which tend to come through your talent intelligence engine, can be really, really powerful for competitive or industry intelligence, which gets out of the talent space and into the business space. And Adam, you did such a beautiful job talking about strategic workforce planning. The simple example for the 75% of people on the call who are not coming out of strategic workforce planning, the versions that I usually talk about are things like, if it takes a decade to build a fighter pilot, And I know I've got these kinds of theaters of war I'm worried about. How much recruiting am I doing? How many people am I putting into that program? What kind of re-recruitment bonuses do I need to use to make sure that my future talent supply will meet my future anticipated need? And being able to really just ask very fundamental business questions like this. It's not an abstract exercise. It's super important. So a deep love for all of these things, obviously people analytics as well. And I see the intersections and cross-pollination between all of them all over the place.
Well, that brings up a really good point, Alexis, which in the article I talked about how I felt like behavioral science was not necessarily like the other branches of the tree because it's infused into
Yes.
all of the different branches. And there's so many different disciplines, frankly, that could call themselves behavioral science as well. It's hard to kind of bucket them into one. And so it's kind of an umbrella category. But how do you see behavioral science being woven into the other branches of the tree? And just to add a little complexity here, how does it play? How does the concept of AI play a role in this space as well in thinking about the risk associated with that from a behavioral science standpoint?
Oh my gosh, we do not have enough time to talk about this in depth. I think that there are such fascinating lessons, even going back now into philosophy and ethics about how we think about AI and the risks associated with those, as well as the opportunity to accelerate all of these things and then to synthesize across them in ways that we may not have had the capacity to do in the past. I think about, golly, when I was doing my graduate research in the 90s, just a little 88 by 88 covariance matrix, so 88 variables, which is not that many, took 27 hours to run on the crappy computer in my lab, right? You can do that in the snap of a finger now, which means that we have much more opportunity to pull data together. And we have tools that will let us much more easily pull them together and standardize them in a way that can help us build insights across. I think that that's really, really important. And those same benefits that help us integrate across talent analytics, talent insight, people analytics, talent insight, strategic workforce planning, and the broader behavioral sciences. That's also true of things like finance and operations, so that we can actually make sure that we are making decisions that don't just improve some other outcome that we care about, like employee engagement is one that frequently comes up, but that we can understand what element there is leading to an impact on the business that is positive and that your CFO would really recognize. I think I'm pretty lucky and maybe a little unusual in this ecosystem that the first 8 years of my career, the first 5 years out of graduate school, I actually was in an operations organization and not in an HR organization. So I really thought about contribution margin, and I really thought about cycle times and quality metrics and customer delivery times and all kinds of other things that are sort of harder business metrics. And I think that as we move into data being more accessible, as we move into better tools to use that data, better tools to do nonlinear kinds of analyses that are more accessible to people who are not professional mathematicians, and as we move into a world where organizations are less constrained by the capacity of the software engineers to write interesting stuff, or people who can code to write interesting stuff, as the barriers to entry there fall, I think the opportunity for more tightly integrated work is just almost limitless. It's super exciting.
Absolutely. Well, the last question I have for you, Alexis, is, I felt like this is a pretty comprehensive branch of the tree, but what branches are missing from behavioral science?
Yeah. So you and I actually had a conversation about this. So thank you for letting me answer this. I think that they are implied in your root system, but not necessarily explicit, and certainly not on the chart that we're looking at right now. I do think there's a ton that goes beyond all four of these that are critical enablers. Things I already mentioned: coding, math, data science, but also the data engineering, making sure things are available. Science communication. So the things that we learn and discover can actually get out of our heads and into somebody else's heads in a way that's compelling. All of the organization development and change management kinds of stuff. I often say that, I'm not here to predict the future. I'm here to make a different future happen. Well, change management is required to make that different future happen. And I could go on for a very long time here. The last one I will mention is all of the science around quality work and risk mitigation kinds of work that really help us not only do this well, but do this well in a durable and sustainable and defensible and transparent way.
I love this. I love that notion. Well, let me build on this for a second. So I get to kind of interview myself for a second about people analytics. So by my definition, and I hate defining people analytics. Anybody who listens to me knows I hate defining it, but I would say that it's the scientific approach to collecting and analyzing internal employee data to understand patterns in our workforce and inform strategic decisions, and ideally even move into a world where maybe even people analytics is making some of those decisions. I come by this similar to Alexis by way of IO psychology. I actually started in workforce planning. And then a lot of what I was doing in workforce planning just started getting rebranded as people analytics. And so this is why the tree always made sense to me, because I've touched each of the branches and I kind of knew a little bit, to Alexis's point about the historian, like being a historian of these fields and saying, hey, you know what? We're all related. But for people analytics in particular, I think the thing I struggled with in terms of trying to define the branches here and what are missing is I kept wanting to include branches from other branches of the tree in the people analytics one, because I kind of have always looked at this from kind of a boundaryless standpoint, or not looking at things in terms of silos and just saying, if I need to pluck from employee engagement over here, or I want to look into competitor insights over there, or I know that our supply and demand is going to be a driver of what's causing us to do things in people analytics one way or another, that always made logical sense to me. But I realized that that's sort of a minority viewpoint in a lot of circles. And so I think that the funny thing about people analytics in particular is the gap that I see in this space is the ability to combine a lot of the internal insights and the internal focus of like what's inside the four walls of an organization, who are our people, what talent do they have, what are their skills, but also being able to couple that with external information and external insights that may be impacting the organization. So that's really a gap that I see out there. And it's, I think, one of the beauties of why the tree of value has potential to have some longevity to it, because I think each of the branches of the tree really are able to tie these together. But people analytics in particular is heavily reliant upon the roots of the tree. And I know all of these fields are, but like people analytics without data is almost nothing. And so it's really important that we have the value of human capital labor data to really ground us. And so before I move on to explain what this visualization is, I wanted to get a little snippet from each of you to ask, what is the importance of data and the data infrastructure and the data grounding in each of our four disciplines? And so I'll start with you, Alexis, go to you, Adam, and then to you, Toby. What is the importance of data and the infrastructure and the architecture there making your branch of the tree possible?
Oh my gosh, the name of it is right there with science. And I want to be clear that an awful lot of stuff that comes in behavioral science is actually qualitative data, which becomes really important as well. And honestly, I would like to sort of poke the people working with HR data, because an awful lot of the tsunami of information that we tend to have is not behavioral science data. It's transaction data. What date did something happen? Who reports to whom? But nothing about why that's true, nothing about what makes someone a good manager. So data becomes absolutely essential in being able to identify differences, being able to identify patterns, whether that is about decision-making, as often you see in economics, whether it is about things like identity and cultural transmission, which you might see, and meaning, which you might see in anthropology, whether it's about how groups engage and what kinds of mistakes they might make in social psychology or in cognitive psychology. All of these things rely on data to separate out hypothesis or belief from evidential reality, from something that is consistent and common and therefore predictable and reliable.
I prefer non-evidential reality. That's what I like to do. No, but Adam, what would you say is the role of data infrastructure in making workforce planning go around?
Yeah, so absolutely critical. So totally with Alexis on the sort of the quant versus the qual. I'd add to that, particularly from a workforce planning perspective, it's the qualitative about the quantitative. And what I'm meaning by that is, yeah, there's lots of data in there, but from a quality perspective, what's the quality? To what extent can we trust it? When does this data come from? What things do we know about the organisation that might indicate, how correct this is and isn't? I'm sure we've seen enough people, enough data sets where we just see these utter random anomalies in there, which you go, well, that can't possibly be the case. But if you just took it at face value, then you're going totally in the wrong direction. So there's definitely that side. There's ideally having a single source of the truth rather than these competing. No, ours is right. And the amount of organisations that I've gone into where HR and finance are basically in the middle of a massive fight about whose definition of FTE is correct. So, which I think leads me on to it's having a single source of language. Are we talking about when we have a particular term? Are we using that in the same way? How do we translate one thing into another? And then the final bit from that data side is that ability to make it as simple as possible so that we can do things fast, and that if making something perfect is going to take a long time, then let's not make perfect the enemy of good.
Yeah. Well, Toby, if you could talk about talent and intelligence and then maybe tee up what this picture is as well, I think that would be a good kind of segue here.
Yeah, for sure. So I think from a TI stance, just to echo completely, it's got to be foundational, but you've got to have the quant and the qual talking. And I think there's a great quote I'm paraphrasing and ruining it, but I no longer bleed orange, but Jeff Bezos once said that if the anecdotes and the data don't match, you're measuring the wrong things. And so for me, I think that qual piece gives a really nice context. And you see that a lot with the TI analytics. You can sit there and you're screaming that your compensation benchmarking is right and that you're paying the right amount for a certain job. But if your recruiters are sitting there crying themselves to sleep every night because they can't get a candidate on the hook for love nor money because we're paying the wrong amount, do you know what? You're probably not paying the right amount for what you need. So I think I 100% agree on the qual piece and the context. In terms of the picture, that's Pando. So Pando is a massive tree system network. It's a huge single organism that's the largest tree in the world by weight and landmass. Not the largest anything, as Alexis can testify, but it's the largest tree system in the world. And it's essentially all one clonal organism. So all of these trees you see are the same tree, essentially. They all have the same root network and it all sprouts up from the same root network and root system. And for me, I find, I don't even know if this was a question, Carl, I'm getting overexcited about Pando. But for me, I find this really exciting because in my head, at least, I see each tree as an entirely different field within our organizations. And I think I probably see it differently to some others on the call we can discuss. But for me, like you could have a tree that's finance, a tree that's marketing, a tree that's business intelligence or whatever, but we all have the same root system. And I think that's where it gets really interesting is where you actually say, well, actually, we're all part of the same massive organization. How can we cross collaborate and cross fertilize across the entire root system rather than even separate trees?
Yeah. No, I think that's fantastic, Toby. And I think it just highlights the importance of the interconnected nature, that this isn't just a forest of trees, this is an interconnected system. And I think that really leads to we've got another poll question. How would you say your data infrastructure is looking today if you were trying to bridge all four branches of the tree or create a whole Pando superorganism at your organization and having the data to do that? I think we've got it broken down into four different categories. And I'm sure my helpers will be popping that up into the chat function. But the next section I have here and why this is important, and I think it builds on the point about Pando and the root system interconnecting to these to make the kind of the superorganism is if you don't have the value of human capital labor data connecting all of these branches, you have a barren tree. And that's a problem for organizations. And this is why we're asking the question about, are you investing in your data infrastructure today? And the shared roots of labor data is what connects these four disciplines. We mentioned competitive intelligence earlier, being able to link internal data within the four walls of your organization, but also with external data about what's going on in the world. What are the things that are going on outside of the four walls of your organization? And we all know that we're living in kind of this VUCA, this banny world. There's a lot of different things, whether they be, geopolitics, it could be AI, it could be labor shortages, which is something that Lightcast talks about all the time, that really they impact our ability to cross these shared roots of what's going on in organizations. And so at Lightcast, one of the things that we've invested heavily in is this concept of DaaS, so data as a service. And if we think about our ability to combine all the four branches of the tree into one, if you want to be able to take the data from your organization, but combine it with data outside of your organization, and to make yourself AI ready, and to make yourself ready to look at things like, oh, we need to pivot our location strategy on a dime for talent intelligence purposes, or oh, we're having labor shortages because we're a healthcare industry and nurses and doctors are retiring in mass. You need that data about what's happening to you. And so Lightcast having the ability to be a data as a service company, it's really exciting in terms of what we're doing. And one of the things I wanted to share is an example of that, and I think I can make this work. Let's hope this works. And I believe my helpers will share this in the chat. I've actually created in partnership with our internal teams, an e-impact dashboard. So e-impact is one of Lightcast tools that's sort of like a proprietary data visualization tool, but it also creates your own web applications. And what it shares is you can query directly into our data warehouses and look and visualize things. And so I thought this for this audience to do a little me search is to share what do we have in terms of external data on people analytics, in terms of the number of people who are practicing it over time, the job postings and job titles and profiles of the people who do this profession. We've got the same thing for talent intelligence. And again, this is an open source resource for you guys. It refreshes monthly. This data just got refreshed this morning. Again, we've got the job titles and job postings and profiles for talent intelligence. We do the exact same thing for workforce planning. And if any of you have been looking for a workforce planning job, you've seen that there's been a ballooning of postings for those. And you can see that reflected here. There's a lot of companies that are hiring for workforce planning managers. And guess what? If you're actually looking into these in terms for the jobs that are active, that are out there, we've created a job postings page that aggregates all the people analytics, workforce planning, and talent intelligence job postings. I mentioned earlier that behavioral science is kind of a difficult one to define. And so I don't necessarily have this in here because it just cuts across so many different variables. But again, this is what's possible by combining internal data with external data. And I think this would be a really great resource for those of you who are attending the webinar today. But with that said, I want to make sure that we have a chance to answer the questions from the audience that we have today. And so if we want to go to the full screen here with all of us, the first question that I've got for you guys is, where do recruitment marketing and employer branding sit? And I think this could point to maybe Toby or Alexis in answering this question.
Toby, I'd be interested in your point of view. To me, they really sit at the intersection of, in particular, all four, but in particular, talent intelligence, so you know where to do the recruiter marketing, strategic workforce planning, so you know what you need to market about, people analytics, so you know how well those things are happening, and behavioral science, so you know what messages will resonate. That's where your employee value proposition and those kinds of things would come out. So those are great questions, and it's a really good example of why you need the whole tree. Toby, would you have things to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And I think it's one of the most interesting ones because it is quite often just boils down to clicks per view or these real vanity metrics, but to actually have the delivery of how is this actually driving a change. I think you need to align all of these and also wrap in compensation in there as well, because how is it reacting versus others? What's the business case? If you've got a price elasticity on a hourly worker, it can fundamentally be impacting your ability to deliver to your customer, for example. So I think it's one of the most underserved, but probably most important areas of analytics within HR generally, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Well, I got a question, and any of you can feel free to jump in on this one. How do you avoid being typecast into a single specialization? So I imagine they're asking about being typecast into like one branch or one sub branch of this tree. What would you recommend?
Gentlemen?
I suppose the question is, who is typecasting you? So it's the question of, is it internally or externally? Because, from an external perspective, if those who took, I don't think anyone has to provide in their resume the exact job title that they had within the organization, because that might not be helpful. The whole point is you're telling a story. So you select a job title that best reflects the work that you did. And if you talk more around the totality of what you do, then it can help break you out of a cocoon that you might be in. If it's within the organization, I suppose the question might be, well, what does it matter? Is it preventing you from doing something or influencing something? I don't know how, particularly within organizations, I don't know how much a name might constrain you in terms of practice. So I just sort of say, work out what it is that is, is there something specific that's preventing you doing? Otherwise, do whatever it is that makes sense and provides value, and don't worry about the name.
Yeah, Adam, I would build on that. We've seen good research, +1 for behavioral science, that suggests people who stay in one stack tend to get promoted up to director level more quickly than people who move around. But people who stay in one stack also tend to top out around that director level. And the people who progress beyond that are ones who have a multitude of experiences. And so the advice I would give people is, and caveat this with the fact that I left a company once because I got super typecast and they just would not let me out of that box, and I got mad, so I left. So sometimes what you need to do to avoid getting typecast is figure out somebody else who will listen to the other part of your stories. But some of it is also be willing to take a stretch assignment, intentionally reach out and partner with folks in adjacent disciplines so that then you can develop sophistication there and move around. I've counseled people sometimes to think about taking some real flyers and treating them as an expat assignment. Well, for myself, I spent 2 years as an HR business partner, super useful in my sort of career doing these kinds of things. I also weirdly spent 2 years in a supply chain team, which you would not think is relevant, but wow, the analogs with strategic workforce planning are huge. So some of it is don't be afraid to take the move. Sometimes take a lateral that is not going to be a promotion or any more money because it'll give you other kinds of things. And after you've done a couple of those, then you clearly will have broader things to draw on. And if you get stuck, sometimes you got to move.
Yeah. Well, I'll tee one to you, Toby. You could build on this last one, or you can answer this because I think they're related. What's the simplest way to message stakeholders the difference in scope between talent intelligence and people analytics, especially when teams sit in different verticals?
I think it depends on the company, is the honest answer. The reality is that Venn diagrams overlapping and it is messy, is the honest answer. And quite often you'll end up with some kind of escalation point because you're both treading on each other's toes. I generally will take the angle of the internal with a bit of external versus the external with a bit of internal. It's kind of a rule of thumb of where the main focus of the function is. But honestly, I just let the work talk for itself. The reality is most people analytics teams, they're so busy driving what they're driving, they don't generally have the spare capacity to disappear off and do some hardcore competitor analysis or competitor benchmarking study or whatever. But honestly, if you have work lined up and you think, all right, this could be shades of grey, go and partner with the other team, work together. Like it's much easier just to partner and both drive in the same direction rather than kind of worrying about pointy elbows and who's treading on whose toes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll say this because we're getting near time. One thing I want to wrap with is everybody get a chance to say a final word here in a second. And I know we've gotten a bunch of questions in the chat. What we'll do is if we can even farm those out to our presenters here, and maybe they can follow up with some of those after the fact. But the last question that I'll answer before I kick it to you guys to give the final word is, as the lines between all four of these branches blur, what terminology would you use to label the function? That's actually one of the reasons why I called it the tree of value, because I didn't necessarily have a good name for this, but I think it would be something about strategy, HR, and data and value. And so maybe you could find some combination of those words together that would be the kind of the new overarching term for that function. But I see a day where AI and the need for DaaS is really going to push us forward in that space. And so I don't know, maybe we can revisit this in a year and see if that name exists. But I want to give the final word because I know this is the time where people start dropping off. So Alexis, any parting words? Adam, and then Toby?
To your question about what might we call this, the word or the label I've used for quite some time has been workforce sciences. I really want to talk, or workforce science or workforce strategy. So the workforce, I think, incorporates the internal, the external, the long horizon skills, engagement, all that other kind of business. And then the last thing that I would say is, particularly as the AI ramps up, unlike some people, I actually see this making humans more valuable because they are doing the things that you cannot automate, which makes each one of them a more precious resource and creates more risk if you make poor decisions. So I am actually excited for an increase in attention to these kinds of questions and pieces of data.
Absolutely.
I love what Lisa said about workforce science. I think that or tree of value or Dave would be suitable names for a profession. So yeah, any of those.
You
heard it here, guys. Toby?
Yeah, I like workforce science. I wrote an article last week before about it becoming organizational engineering. But I think I don't really mind labels. Call us what you want. As long as we're doing interesting stuff, doing interesting work, and doing the right sort of work, I don't really mind. Call me anything.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for participating in the Tree of Value webinar. Thank everybody who's still here for being a part of this. Really excellent discussion. I am so thrilled to have been involved, but I'm Cole Napper, joined by Alexis Fink, Toby Coleshaw, and Adam Gibson. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.